This week we are in chapter 18, looking at the foot. If you haven't already watched the animated video prior to this one in the module, then please go back and watch that one first. I'm just going to touch up on some stuff that the guy talked about in the animated video, some stuff that I want you to know for the quiz and to focus on. Okay, so here's the foot, looking at the bony anatomy. On the left hand side, we're looking at the top of the foot. We're looking as if we were looking down at our own feet. And then on the right hand side here, you're looking at the foot from underneath, looking at it from the bottom. Okay, so in that video, he already did a great job talking about the talus and its involvement with the ankle, and we already talked about that last week. Right below the talus is the calcaneus, and we want to know that. We want to know the talus, we want to know the calcaneus, which is also our heel bone. Okay, and then sitting just in front of the talus is the navicular. Okay, and the navicular is one of the biggest tarsal bones, part of the tarsals. Okay, and then on the outside is the cuboid, and then these three bones in the middle here are all called the cuneiforms. Depending where you look in the literature, it's either the medial, middle, and lateral cuneiform, or medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiform, or some places they just call it the first, second, and third cuneiform. But all I need you to know for quiz purposes is that these collectively are the tarsal bones. Okay, so you need to know talus, calcaneus, and the tarsal bones. Okay, and then sitting in front of the tarsal bones is the metatarsals. Okay, and we number them 1 through 5, starting with your big toe 1, all the way through 5 at that pinky toe. Okay, and then the phalanges, and again that video did a great job of showing your big toe, the first phalange has 2 segments, a proximal and a distal phalanx, and then the other 4 phalanges all have a proximal, middle, and distal phalanx. Okay, and then the joints in between the phalanxes are called interphalangeal joints, and the joints in between your metatarsals and your phalanges are called the metatarsal phalangeal joints, or the MTP joints. Alright, so that's it for bony anatomy. Something I wanted to touch on here is the arches of the foot. Okay, we have 3 arches in the foot, and I like the diagram in this first one. It shows the transverse or metatarsal arch. You can call it either one, but that arch takes up this whole segment. Okay, so the arch is all of this area in between these 2 lines. Okay, so that's the transverse or metatarsal arch, is that whole area in there. Okay, and then down here we can see the medial longitudinal arch, which is on the same side as your big toe, and the lateral longitudinal arch, which is on the same side as your pinky toe. Okay, the medial longitudinal arch is bigger, and there's 2 conditions here that I like to talk about. One is pes cavus. Pes cavus is when this arch is unusually high, right there, and then pes planus is when this arch is unusually low. We also call it flat-footed. Okay, so the arch would just come straight along. It wouldn't really be an arch at all. Okay, so pes planus and pes cavus are important when talking about the foot, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit later, so good to know those. Okay, we can see the the Achilles tendon here on the back of the calf. We talked about that last week. It wraps around and it attaches onto the calcaneus. Okay, and then really kind of stemming from that same spot where it attaches is the plantar fascia. And the plantar fascia comes along the bottom of the foot, along the arch, and attaches near the different toes. Okay, and that helps hold your arch in place. The plantar fascia helps hold the height of your arch. Okay, looking at some ligaments here. I have a few that I want you to know. We already talked about the ankle ligaments, which is really the most important part. Here's the lateral ankle ligaments that we talked about, the anterior talofibular calcaneofibular ligament and the posterior talofibular ligament. And then on the inside we have those deltoid ligaments. But it's also good to know that there are ligaments in between each of these tarsal joints and the tarsals and the metatarsals, and then in between all of the phalanges. Okay, so there's also ligaments that attach all of those joints. Yeah. The muscles are really just the muscles from the lower leg, so we talked about those last week. I just like to show this diagram so that you can see. In the video, he talked about the extensor tendons being on the top of the foot and then the flexor tendons being underneath the foot. But this diagram does a good job of showing us that the muscles for those tendons are still in the lower leg, the majority of them. Okay, so I mean, we do have like one extensor muscle down here in the foot, but the majority are up in the lower leg. And then via the tendon, they control the different toes and other aspects of the foot. So it's good to know that the muscles are up there, but the tendons come down and attach to the toes. Okay, this picture gives us a good diagram. We can see some of the extensor tendons here in the foot, and you can probably see this on yourself as well. Those are the extensor tendons right there. The flexor tendons are in a similar spot on the bottom, but you can't see them because there's so much padding and other musculature on the bottom of your foot. One that I really like people to know is the base of the fifth metatarsal. That's on the outside of the foot right here. Over here, it's right there. And that one's important if you're going to be taping. If you take the Kin 10A class where we teach some taping, especially ankle taping, it's good to know where that base of the fifth is. And then I just like how this shows the arches. Okay, so we have the lateral longitudinal arch and the medial longitudinal arch, and then the transverse arch, which really takes up all of this space. Okay. When we talk about functional anatomy of the foot, it's just important to realize the importance of the foot in the kinetic chain. So a lot of times foot injuries or foot chronic conditions can lead to injury in the shin, injury in the knee, injury in the hip, injury in the low back. So a lot of that is tied in via that kinetic chain. So the foot is very important in evaluating those injuries. It's also good to know that a lot of injuries in the foot are overuse or chronic injuries, just from the repetitive slamming on the ground, or using bad shoes that don't give good support to your foot. So just important to know those. I wanted to talk a little bit about normal walking gait. You guys certainly don't need to know everything about gait. There's a whole lot of research that goes into walking gait and running gait, but I wanted you to get a general idea of it. So if you look at this woman's right foot, we're going to follow it through the different stages of normal gait. Okay, so initial contact, we call that heel contact. That's where her heel is going to strike first. Okay, and then as she shifts forward and puts weight on that foot, we call that the loading phase. Then as she's totally on that foot and balanced, that is mid-stance. Okay, and then as you start to shift towards putting your weight back onto the other foot, we call that terminal stance. And then lastly, we have toe off, which is where you push off that back toe. Okay, and now continuing to follow the right foot, we have an initial swing phase, a mid-swing phase, and then a terminal swing phase, which is right where the heel is about to contact again. Okay, so then that takes us back to the beginning where we're at heel contact. If you notice, this is the stance phase. This is when we have the foot that we're talking about, the right foot is actually in touch with the ground. And that's 60% of our total walking gait is in a stance phase. And when you think about it, 60% plus 60% for the other foot would be 120%, which really just shows the overlap where both feet are on the ground at the same time, which is how we define walking. Okay. So we have a stance phase and then we have a swing phase. All right, in this diagram we can see the force or the pressure that we are putting through the foot as we walk. So when we first hit heel strike, we get the pressure back here in the heel. And as we start to load and go into that loading phase on the foot, we put our weight towards the outside, almost as if the weight's going to go into our pinky toe. And then once we get to mid-stance, that pressure comes back to the center of our foot. And then when we go to toe off, as you guys probably know, the last thing that is touching the ground before toe off is the big toe. So this is the path of force or pressure that our foot follows as we go through that walking phase. So if either of these are messed up, either this normal walking gait is not being done properly, or if the pressure is, say we're pushing off of our pinky side too much, or say we're rolling into our arch too soon, this can cause chronic conditions and chronic injuries to the foot. So when we talk about pes cavus and pes planus, people with a very flat arch tend to roll and put pressure into this area a lot sooner because that arch is flattened. And so instead, this path of pressure would come this way and then all the way through the big toe. And that can lead to a lot of problems, especially once you get into sports and running and being very active. That can cause a lot of issues. Okay, so the foot serves as a shock absorber when we're running and when we're walking. Okay, and then a lot of times when we switch from walking to running, people switch from a heel strike first to a forefoot strike, which is where basically you're running and you push off your toes, and then your toes are the first thing to come back down and touch the ground. Sprinters tend to be forefoot strikers. Long distance runners tend to strike with their heel first. The most important thing that I have found is that heel strike, people who run with a heel strike first have less incidence of injury because they get that shock absorption, whereas sprinters don't get that. Okay, we'll hit the rehab on the next video.